balancing between cognitive aspects and intuitive belief aspects, there's also a whole ornate world of religiosity built into philosophy and philosophizing about religion. And where the most interesting stuff has been done with this in the realm of our interests is something called temporal lobe personality. This was first described by Norman Geschwin, Harvard neurologist, one of the most influential neurologists of the last century. One always has to use words like giant of neurology. Geschwin was amazing. And Geschwin noticed somewhere along the way that there was an interesting personality profile, not everyone, but at higher than chance levels, among people with a certain type of temporal lobe epilepsy. And he wound up calling this temporal lobe personality. What were its features? Person loses their sense of humor. Person tends to perseverate, repeat highly habitual stuff. They eat the same meal every night for weeks on end. They have 5 copies of the same t-shirt, all of that. Hand in hand with that, they become neophobic. They are afraid of novel things. They develop, wonderful term, a viscous, a sticky personality. They just get a couple of friends and stick close to them and have them stick close to you. So you look at this and you say, well, okay, loss of a sense of humor, new stuff is kind of scary. You want to keep your real friends very close to you. Maybe that's got nothing to do with some interesting neurological thing. Maybe it's because you have a crappy, awful disease. What's the control group? People with equally severe types of epilepsy where the seizure originates in a different part of the brain. This is specific to temporal lobe epilepsy where the seizures begin in the temporal lobe. 2 additional features that you see that Geschwin first described: hypergraphia and obsessive writing. This is somebody who comes in and you're their new neurologist and they say, oh, hi, it's great to meet you. I think really that it's important for doctors to see you as a whole person. So I just prepared this little document telling you about my views about the world, a 70-page manuscript. And the next week they come in with a 30-page addendum. And what are they very often being hypergraphic about? Religious philosophy, obsessed with it. So this is the profile. This is the temporal lobe profile. And there's already been one great novel called Lying Awake about a nun who turns out to develop this. And of course, it turns out she has a tumor there and has to decide whether her religious ecstasy coming out of all of this is a disease or a blessing and what she should do about it. But this was this profile first described by Geschwin. And it gave rise to this wonderful anecdote where Geschwin, neurologist, he would go around with a neurology residents and then they would do rounds on their own in the morning. And one day they come in and the chief resident was sort of reporting on this one kid in one of the rooms, this kid who has temporal lobe epilepsy and sort of his med status and all that sort of thing. And then at the end, he kind of wanted to poke Geschwin, no doubt, like a young stud on his way up dominance display or whatever. He said, oh yeah, by the way, I talked with the kid some, and he doesn't fit your profile of that temporal lobe personality. And Geschwin said, yeah, how do you know? He said, I asked him if he was religious, and he said he wasn't. Geschwin says, idiot, out of my way, and goes storming down the hall with the chief resident and all the other residents running behind him. And they come into the room, and Geschwin gets in there and does a neurology workup on the kid, and then says to the kid, oh, by the way, are you religious? And the kid says, no, I'm not. And then Geschwin asks the key question. He says, oh, why not? And this 12-year-old launches into an hour-long lecture about the inconsistencies of Christ's Sermon on the Mount and Bertrand Russell's critique of Christianity and all that. And at some point, Geschwin leaves the room and just left the senior resident there stuck with this kid and saying, take notes about what he's saying. It's not that you were religious, you were obsessed with the philosophy, the very cerebral aspects of why you should or shouldn't be religious. More aspects of this. Hypergraphia, there's been at least one paper, and make of this what you will, but by one neurologist doing sort of after the fact, like play neurology diagnosis, arguing that St. Paul had temporal lobe epilepsy. He was described as, well, there's no evidence of him coming up with a lot of jokes. He was hypergraphic like crazy. He helped write the Bible and all of that. He was known to have epileptic seizures, and of the descriptions of it, it sounded like temporal lobe grand mal seizures. And the guy was certainly into religiosity stuff. Who knows? But nonetheless, another version. Think about this. You struggle with these issues for years on end, perhaps, trying to decide what religion means to you and the role of your deity or deities in your life and all of that, and instead have some screwed up potassium channels so that once every few months they start firing like crazy in this part of the brain, and you arrive at the same place with the same endpoint there through a very different mechanistic pathway. Okay, so this takes us now, coming out the other end of